Please Hold by Ciaran O'Driscoll is a wonderful poem, and like many of these modern poems which look ostensibly quite simple, look simple on the surface, there's a real hidden depth to it, and it's a satire. So O'Driscoll does comment a lot politically, and he says that he finds the easiest way to challenge things with any kind of power is through satire. And satire is when you use humour or irony or exaggeration, and he uses all of those things here in order to ridicule or expose something, particularly something political. And this is perhaps the first thing that I would point out to you about these hidden depths, because I've often had students say, oh, this is a satire about, like when your dad can't work technology and gets really, really annoyed. And yes, there is an element that the narrator of the poem is a person who's getting frustrated with the technology around them, but that's very, very surface level, and we'll have a look at different layers to the poem. It is a diatribe, so a very forceful expression through a voice explaining how they feel frustrated about something. So we would probably call that in modern English, a rant, but diatribe is a better word. And what he's ranting about is firstly the desire to talk to someone who understands his bank, not a robot, and not to get stuck in this kind of cycle of being transferred. But underneath that is the idea of dehumanisation, because he's concerned that kind of machines are taking over the world. And there's something very kind of Terminator and Skynet-like about the way he feels about this. But in addition to that, there's also some playfulness around the idea of time, as we've found with some of the other poems. So what is the past, what is the present, what is the future, and how do they all move together? Now, for the most part, the poem is one long stanza in free verse. But then right at the end, you do get a tercet, a 3-line stanza, which rhymes, which obviously stands out because it's so different in structure and in rhythm. But we'll deal with the really long free verse stanzas. So there's no apparent rhythm, no apparent rhyme, but there are patterns within it. So it's free verse with lots of patterns, which we'll explore. And it's written in various voices. And that's one of the things that makes the poem really interesting, I think, is it doesn't stay in one voice. It moves between voices. So you've got the narrator, and sometimes he's actually speaking to his wife or speaking to the robot. But other times we get his internal dialogue, where we can just hear his thoughts. And then we also get the voice of his wife. And then we get the voice of the robot that he's trying to speak to on the phone. So it's interesting how the poem moves through these various voices. And in the first couple of lines, the poem actually begins with his wife speaking, which I think might set up the idea that he feels under scrutiny. He can't just talk. There's people butting in all of the time to tell him what to think and what to do. And the first couple of lines there set up a paradox, a kind of impossible being. This is the future, we are already there. So you can't be in the future, can you? That's paradoxical. And that tension in the first line of someone telling him something which is paradoxical, I think sets up the sense of confusion and frustration in the rest of the poem really, really well. The future can't be the same as the present, we can't already be there. Your future, here, she says, almost like she's handing it to him. Notice throughout the poem how much the lines are end-stopped. There's a real structure built through the end stops there. And by structure, I mean a sense of, like, the poem's built out of very tight units. And I think that gives you the sense of this robotic voice talking. Out of all the poems in the collection, there is very little enjambment and no sense of free flowing. It feels here that the poetic voice feels really constricted and controlled, and you can see that through the use of the end stops on the lines. And he's talking to a robot on the phone. The robot is giving me countless options, none of which answer to my needs. So countless there, I think, goes with the satire, because that's hyperbolic, isn't it? The robot's not really telling him so many options he can't count them. And then you've also got here irony. Wonderful, says the robot when I give him my telephone number. And great, says the robot when I give him my account number. I have a wonderful telephone number and a great account number, but I can find nothing to meet my needs. That's why it's ironic, because the robot's saying everything's wonderful and everything's great, but it actually isn't. It's the opposite. It's not useful or helpful. Now, notice how a lot of what the robot says is capitalised, even when it's in the middle of the sentence and doesn't need to be capitalised. You know, down here, for example. So it's not just a kind of grammatical feature of reported speech. And I think the capitalisation gives the sense that the robot has got some authority in his words, and the narrator feels increasingly powerless. Now, all the way through the poem, you've got anaphora, haven't you? You've got repeated phrases. We've got ones from the robot about his the greatness and the wonderfulness of his phone number, and the use of the word wonderful comes up a lot. We've got this is the future, and we've got these repeated phrases all the way through the poem. The wife also chips in as well repetitively, but her this is the future, I think, sounds almost like a mantra, like she's chanting it at him. It's almost like she's become part of the machine and nobody's really listening to him. Everybody's just repeating things back to him. So here in particular, I think he gets stuck in what you might call a sort of feedback loop. And a lot of modern poems experiment with this idea where you're trying to follow verbal instructions and everything goes round in a cycle and everything gets repeated. And we've got more, capitalisation of the words that the robot's saying to illustrate its power and its control over the situation. So, down here, suddenly, I scream, agent! And you've got a caesura to illustrate he's at the peak of his frustration and he gets cut off, he says. And that's obviously got a double meaning, because it could be that he's getting cut off on the call, but also cut off from society. So there's a sense of alienation here. And even more so, I think, because he's talking about the way he feels cut off from control, you could talk about disenfranchisation. So that means cut off from a powerful system or a political system. He's disenfranchised now by being this cut off. And then we get the wife's mantra back again. And then we go back into the list. And I'm talking to the robot on the phone. And quite often you'll notice these conjunctions sorry, not conjunctions. Yeah, conjunctions, sorry. Starting the sentence. So they give a sense of kind of simple repetition. It's almost irritating as a reader to listen to it, particularly as a student of literature, because we're told never to start sentences with the conjunction and, aren't we? And it's simple, childlike English, almost as if he's being reduced to a childlike state. But look at the contrast, because we've got and, but then we've also got really complex language, the guise of countless alternatives. So we suddenly go into complex polysyllabic words of several syllables language there, which again I think shows further irony, because it's an irony of a man who can speak like this but is also going and because he feels like he's not being listened to. Then we go on to this part of the poem where he's hearing this hold music. We appreciate your patience, of course. The poetic voice feels ironic because he doesn't feel appreciated and he's not being patient. And you can tell that now because he starts to swear. He starts to use expletives when he's thinking about the hold music. Now, Eine kleine Nacht music, if you Google it and listen to it, you will hear, you probably heard this as hold music. It's really, really common. And so there's a humour there in that readers will recognise this and go, oh gosh, yes, I've heard that when I've been on hold. But there's a couple of other things going on here that are a little bit more thoughtful. So Eine kleine Nacht music literally means a little serenade. And a serenade is a piece of music that's meant to be dedicated to someone, written in honour of someone. So there's another irony there, in that he doesn't feel that anything is being done for him personally. He doesn't feel that he's being catered to at all. He feels that he's being treated treated badly as part of a big group. So there's an irony there. And then you've got here something called bathos, because we get eine kleine Nachtmusik, please hold, eine kleine Nachtmusik, please hold, eine kleine effing Nachtmusik, and so you're at the peak of this irritation, and the robot transfers me to himself. And bathos is understatement for comic effect. And the idea that the robot has now transformed to himself after all of this stress and all of this swearing shows you in an understated way that he is getting really fed up. Notice as well now that he started to refer to the robot through personal pronouns like he and himself. So the robot now has taken on further power because it's becoming more like a living creature. I'm hesitating to say it's becoming human. It's more to me like the poetic voice feels like he's becoming a machine being sucked into this system. And I've got further evidence, I think, for that here, in that in this part of the poem, he starts talking about my translator. And by that, he means his internal dialogue. The part of his brain that is still trying to think freely outside this system. And that tells me that he feels he's being sucked into this system, and the robot now is almost like the human and he's part of the machine. The fact that he calls it a translator makes him sound robotic almost, like Google Translate, which wouldn't have been a thing when he wrote this poem, but there were lots and lots of electronic translating devices available then. And we're still referring to the robot here as he. Then we get the wife voice back again, and my wife says, and my translator says, and it's like they are all part of the machine and he is outside it. But we've got this internal dialogue where he's desperately trying to hang on to a little bit of independence, and his internal dialogue comes up with a rather radical solution, and there's an almost anarchic tone to this part of the poem which I really like. And if you write about this poem, do try to show these little nuanced bits which will go much further than saying, oh, it's a poem about a man who's really cross with a, automated computer phone system. Here he sounds radical, and here he sounds archaic. Anarchic. Anarchic is the right word. Because he is trying to rebel. You're going to go out and loot now to buy stuff because the computerized bank has stolen all of your money. You're going to go out and steal. Then we come to this little tercet at the end, which is really interesting that O'Driscoll's decided to put this on its own. And it rhymes. So I think that rhyming there gives the poet back a greater sense of control. It's a summation, a conclusion to all of what he's been discussing throughout the poem. And he starts off with an injunction, please hold, please grow old, please grow cold, please do what you're told. And then that turns into grow old, grow cold, so it becomes an imperative. He's being commanded to do these things. So part of this poem is about the inexorable, that's something that we don't notice, and inevitable, something we can't stop, passage of time. You will grow old, whether you like it or not, because we're now in the future. And he loses that placatory word, please, and it becomes a command. So as well as this really interesting debate about the fear of automation, rather like Skynet talking over, he also relates it to our fear of the passage of time.